Hello, everyone. Welcome to our March edition of Dynamic Dialogue. This is a really crazy time. I've been saying that for 2 years, and I don't think I'm going to stop because everywhere you look today, there's news blasts and updates about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And there's been an overwhelming amount of support for Ukraine and the Ukrainian people from across the globe, with obviously the exception of Russia. What I want to do today is just share with you some broad pieces of information on a variety of categories and commodities that I'm finding, that I'm seeing, things that are expected to be problems, are currently problems, or have high potential to be problems or impacted by the Ukrainian invasion. Because it's easy to think that that's halfway around the world and it's a small piece and it doesn't affect much. But I'm going to show you some things that say maybe you should think about this maybe a little deeper and above and beyond the pandemic and those challenges. We're going to have some challenges here. So this is our series of dynamic dialogue webinars. We're doing these monthly, although with the situation in Ukraine, if we get much more activity around that, I might switch to bi-monthly again. But for now, we're doing the fourth Thursday of the month at 11:30 a.m. Pacific. We are taking suggestions for topics. Otherwise, we come up with some, and I have some that are slated, but I'll tell you that I'm being more flexible with those than I was in the past. So a lot of opportunity there. If you have something that you want to know more about, you can always email me. So we'll do a short presentation, then open it up for questions, comments. We'll stick to an hour or less. And the link that you use to join today is good for the end of the year. And if you're looking at this online, then these get posted every month. So thanks for joining us today. So, the current situation is, we all know, Russia invaded the Ukraine. This is an interesting quote from a gentleman named Eric Oak from Panjiva, which is a global intelligence firm. And Eric is a research director there. And he says, from a U.S. economic perspective, we look at imports from Ukraine rising almost 30% year over year in the last quarter of 2021. Disruptions that are likely to be felt across all industries, but the majority of U.S. imports from the country are in the metals category, which is like 60% in 2021. And this increased almost 62% year over year in the fourth quarter. February data is likely going to indicate a significant fall in growth. I haven't seen that yet. Companies that are importing metals, mostly pig iron from the Ukraine, they include Nucor, Usider, SPA, and Steel Dynamics. And these imports rose 68%, 66%, and 16% year over year in 2021. So there was a robust amount of activity going on. And of course, these sources are likely going to be disrupted in some way if and as the conflict continues. So I think it's much longer now than Russia initially anticipated. That's what we're hearing from lots of different sources. But here we are in the middle of this. So these numbers change, and sometimes they change daily. But the latest information I have says that there are 36 countries, including the U.S. and Canada, that have closed their airspace to Russian aircraft. And of course, Russia has responded in kind and closed their airspace to these countries as well. What we're seeing is air shipments from China to Europe or from China to the Eastern U.S. Those sometimes are being rerouted because of the no-fly zone over Russia. So it's wreaking some havoc there in the routes that they use, and they're using alternate routes or sometimes alternate modes of transportation. So as we were just talking about before I started the session, we all know that the ocean traffic between Asia and the US has been crazy for the last couple of years, and it's probably just going to be crazier now because of the no-fly zones. China-Europe Railroad, there's a rail service there that goes across through Russia. That had a huge boom in 2021. And now there's lots of cancellations and there's lots of risk with taking that route. So again, they're looking for alternate modes of transportation, alternate routes of transportation. And that was a significant investment in that China rail system. So that's another impact that we're seeing. Over 2,100 US and 1,200 European firms have tier 1 Russian suppliers. So your company may not, but there are 2,100 US companies that do have tier 1 Russian suppliers. And I'll show you some more that you probably have a lot of tier 2, tier 3, maybe even tier 4 suppliers that may have Russian or Ukrainian roots. For the Ukraine, 450 US and 200 EU firms have tier 1 Ukrainian suppliers. At the tier 3 level, 190,000 US companies and 109,000 EU firms have suppliers in Russia or Ukraine. So that ups that stake a lot more. And here's some of the bigger players. IT software is 13% of those relationships, customer service 7%, trading and distribution 6%, and industrial machinery 4%. But again, 190,000 US companies have tier 3 level suppliers in either either the Russia or the Ukraine. So here's what we're seeing in some immediate effects. Just overall, Russia is less than 2%, and the Ukraine is about 0.14% of the global GDP. So if you look at that on the face of it, it says less than 2% of the global GDP, 0.14% of the global GDP shouldn't have a lot of impact, right? Well, maybe not. Let's look at this a little deeper. Russia is providing about 40% of Europe's natural gas. And as you know, that second pipeline that was about to be approved has been put on hold. So the investment is done, but they are not turning that on because 65% of Germany's natural gas comes from Russia. So that was a big step for Germany to take, to say, no, we're not going to authorize that pipeline to go further. Russia is the third largest oil exporter in the world, but only 7% of US imports have come from that. And now, of course, we've stopped any US imports of oil. So 7% of our imports came from Russia, and yet that drove our prices up. So don't ask me to figure that one out because I'm still in sticker shock when I go fill up my car. But food is a different matter. Russia and the Ukraine combine for 1/3 of the global wheat exports. And if you're not gluten-free, take a look at all the things that you buy that have flour and wheat in them. And that's bad for us because we import a lot of that, even though we do grow a lot here. But smaller countries like Kazakhstan and Tanzania import as much as 90% of their wheat from Russia. So these are poorer countries and they need that to feed their people. So this is going to have a big impact on that. And if you know what wheat is, it's a grain and it has to get grown, it has to get planted, and it has to get harvested. So right now we know that in the Ukraine, a lot of the men have been almost conscripted, and they are being called to fight from age 20 to age 60. So that's a lot of the workforce, and some of those are farmers that would be thinking about putting their plants in pretty soon. So, and in Russia, they have their army, but they have other places that are impacted. And we'll talk more about the food in just a minute, but that's a big potential issue, because if we don't get that wheat grown this year, then that's going to affect us going forward. You should also know that the Ukraine produces about 90% of semiconductor grade neon that's used here in the United States. And we know semiconductors are already a problem. So if that wasn't lingering long enough, and I saw several projections that said that won't settle down till 2024, now we find that semiconductor grade neon comes out of the Ukraine, and Russia provides over 1/3 of the palladium that we use in semiconductors. So that's another problem for the semiconductor industry and production, especially here in the US. And then Russia is the dominant exporter of nickel and titanium forgings. And we'll look at that a little bit in a little bit more detail. So here are some of the companies that are cutting ties with Russia. Google, Alphabet, they have been blocking the dollars that they collect from the YouTube ads. So in Russia, they're not getting any dollars from any ads on that kind of thing. AT&T, who you don't usually associate with movies, but they are deep in that. They are not releasing the Batman movie, and they're going to curtail some other movie releases. Dell, one of the biggest computer manufacturers in the world, has quit selling their products into Russia, but also into the Ukraine. So they're not selling into the Ukraine at this point in time. Disney has announced they're not doing any new film releases in Russia at this point. GM has suspended exported products. They only sell about 3,000 cars annually into Russia. But what about spare parts? And what about a lot of other things? There's at least 10 automakers that so far have suspended business in Russia, and some have shut factories that they have there indefinitely. So it's not a lot of cars on an annual basis, but GM plus at least 10 other automakers. So there's some impact there to not only new cars, but think about service and spare parts as well. So that can be a huge impact. Harley Davidson suspended export of their motorcycles. MasterCard has blocked all the financial transactions into Russia, in and out of Russia. Meta Facebook has blocked Facebook ads to Russia, but they've blocked them in the Ukraine too. So the social media thing is a big issue, especially in Russia, where they're controlling what people see, and they're denying that this is a war, and there's a lot of mixed messages going on in there. And Facebook was one of the ways that people were saying, no, this is happening. I've seen at least 2 recordings of Ukrainians talking to family members that are in Russia, and the Russians are saying, no, that's not happening. And the Ukrainian, one was female, one was male, were saying, in one case, Dad, I'm standing right here. Can you hear that noise? This is what's happening here. So don't believe what they're telling you, because I'm sitting here. And that's kind of frustrating to the Ukrainians to be talking to their relatives and saying, this is happening to me, and the relatives denying it. Uber has a big relationship with Yandex.Taxi, and they're divesting that. So they put a lot of investment into that to build that relationship and get that going. Now they're saying we're going to divest ourselves of that. Visa, like MasterCard in kind, is blocking financial transactions. And you're seeing companies like McDonald's. They have temporarily closed 847 Russian restaurants, and it's costing them about $50 million a month. But they are continuing to pay 62,000 workers in Russia, at least for now. So they've closed the stores, and that's huge. So 847 stores, $50 million a month, they say. And then yet they're paying the workers because they don't want the workers to pay the penalty for that. But there's a lot of companies that are not cutting ties with Russia. So Mondelez is a company that probably a lot of you aren't familiar with. I was kind of surprised, but they make things like Ritz crackers, Cadbury chocolates, and Oreo cookies. So they say they're scaling back on non-essential activity, but they are maintaining continuity of the food supply, because who knows, as you all know, I'm sure we can't live without Oreos, and neither can those in Russia. So they're getting some heat for that, but that's what they're doing. Ferragamo says its activities in Russia are managed by local distributors, but they're continuing to sell. And if you know Ferragamo products, those are high-end designer shoes and purses and accessories, things like that. So they are continuing to sell to the rich and powerful, must be to the rich and powerful in Russia, because I know I can't afford their products here. So if they can buy them in Russia, then they're more well off than I am. Mars, we all are familiar with Mars, and they say they probably invested $2 billion in Russian factories. They're making a significant amount of their pet food there, one of their product lines you might not be familiar with that is a Mars product, but Whiskas and Pedigree are 2 of their brands. They've suspended advertising in both Russia and Belarus, and announced that they would donate $2 million to support humanitarian efforts in the Ukraine. So $2 million is kind of a drop in the bucket to that, but I would probably expect that to go up. Nestle also is continuing to sell in Russia, and they make, we know, candy bars, but they also make things like powdered milk and baby products too. Kimberly-Clark makes a wide variety of products like Kleenex, Cottonelle, and Huggies diapers. So if you think about the products you find in Costco, paper products, because if you don't know, Kimberly-Clark has an exclusive agreement with Costco that Costco sells their products only. They only make 3% of their revenue, which is about $600 million annually, from Russia. And they've expanded their business there as recently as 2019. And so they are continuing to sell their products. Estee Lauder, who makes their signature product, Estee Lauder brand, as well as brands like Clinique, Aveda, Aramis, Bobbi Brown, Donna Karan, Michael Kors perfumes, Tommy Hilfiger, Origins, and lots more, they've pulled out, but Coty has not. So Coty is cosmetics. They make 3% of their revenue in Russia, which is about $150 million. And alongside Coty, who's not pulled out, Unilever makes cosmetics and things like ice cream, and they continue to sell into Russia. So we see a lot of companies like Estee Lauder who've shut things down, but Coty has not. A lot of hotels are still open: Hilton's, Hyatt's, Intercontinentals, Marriott's, several locations for each of those hotels. They're still open and continuing to do business there. Citigroup has said that they're working toward exiting their consumer banking business in Russia. And they said, as a quote, "As we work toward that exit, we're operating that business on a more limited basis, given current circumstances and obligations. We are also supporting our corporate clients in Russia, including many American and European multinational corporations, who we are helping as they suspend or unwind their business." So Citicorp is doing some things, but they have about $9.8 million exposed in Russia. We're seeing tires like Bridgestone, Pirelli tires production remains open on those products. Caterpillar, John Deere, Cargill, all of those are continuing to stay open. Caterpillar has been in Russia longer than many. They opened their first office there in 1973, and they have 180 Eurasia locals there. John Deere is doing, they have suspended shipments of machines to Belarus and Russia, but they are operating their manufacturing and distribution plants there. And then Cargill has 2,500 employees, about $1 billion invested in agro processing, and they're continuing to do business there. So you can see these companies have, even though they're very large companies, they have a big stake in this, and some of these can pull out easier than others. So there's a lot of different reasons that companies are still doing business there. Some of the reasons that companies are citing is that they're selling essential items. So you can listen to some of the what they call essential items. You might say Kleenex and toilet paper are essential items that are coming from Kimberly-Clark. You can argue for or against that, but a lot of those companies are standing on that and saying that's what they're selling, that's what they're producing, they're going to keep doing that. A number of companies have joint venture agreements. So they have partnerships with companies. So the ownership is part Russian, part other. And so they can't make all the decisions, and they can't close those down unilaterally. There are ethical reasons companies are staying open and continuing to do business with Russia. Things like companies that produce and sell medicines, especially vaccines and medical equipment, are continuing to do business in Russia with Russia. And at the same time, Russia is warning that companies that cease production or even put temporary holds on things, they're warning that they may seize those assets and arrest employees. So we're already seeing that Russia has made a play for several aircraft that are owned by different companies. They're threatening that with McDonald's to seize the assets and open their own kind of Russian McDonald's. Employees, if they don't cooperate can be arrested, or if they continue to do things that are against Russia or don't go to work, that can be an issue too. And Russia's passing laws all the time to say, now we're going to put people in jail for this. They've rounded up thousands of people for protesting. Over 14,000 is the last number that I've heard that they have arrested for protesting and Russia refuses to call it a war. They refuse to call it an invasion. But for the rest of the world, that's what many of us are calling that. Pepsi has a split decision. They've agreed to stop selling products like Pepsi and 7-Up, but they do make what they consider daily essentials. They make things like milk and cheese, yogurt, baby formula, but they also make potato chips. So I'm not sure that potato chips are the ones I would consider essentials, but I understand baby formula, milk, cheese, yogurt, getting people fed is important. And then Koch Industries says they have reasons for continuing business, that they are citing the well-being of the employees. So they say they're looking out for the employees, and they feel that abandoning those employees and their facilities there could or would benefit the Russian government. Again, Russia is threatening to seize assets, and so they may be afraid that that's what would happen, is that their facilities would be taken over by the Russian government, and if they abandon their employees, that would be a problem. So they are continuing to do business there. If we look at automobiles, we talked a little bit about GM and the 10 other companies that are suspended right now, but what we're seeing is increased gasoline prices everywhere. That is creating an interest in fuel efficient vehicles, both hybrids and electric vehicles. So if that wasn't a big deal before, like I said, I had sticker shock, and the first time I paid over $5.50 a dollar for gas, I told myself, just don't look. You just buy gas when you have to, limit where you're going, and kind of close your eyes and figure out how to get through it. What we've seen recently prior to this invasion was a boom in SUV and truck sales that led a lot of auto manufacturers to decrease and discontinue certain fuel efficient production vehicles and reduce those, like hybrid sedans. They reduced their production levels of that. And now we're seeing that renewed interest in fuel efficient vehicles because companies had gone to electric and still staying in the SUV and truck businesses. So they're going to be in a quandary with what they want to build in the short run, and they're already hampered by chips. So this is a real issue for automobile production. We're seeing that the auto executives are bullish on the electric vehicles, but inventory isn't as high as they would like it to be because they don't have the chips and they haven't had the time to ramp their production sufficiently. Again, we've got chip shortages that don't show any sign of letting up. And spare parts can be a problem, especially in Russia when these companies have decided, no, they're not shipping parts into Russia any longer. So there's potential for a lot of impact from that. And if you know, the spare parts are not always made by the main car company, the GMs, the Fords, the Toyotas. They're made by other companies and sold. They're authorized by GM, Ford, Toyota, Honda, but they are not necessarily owned by that. So there's smaller companies that are making a lot of those spare parts, and they are selling into distributors and centers, repair centers that are actually owned by the dealerships and by sometimes by the car company themselves. But there's a lot of other companies involved in that could be hurt by that. If we look at the energy and fuel, which is one of the first things that everybody said, ouch, over, Europe is looking at liquefied natural gas to reduce their reliance on Russian energy. I gave you those numbers before. Heavy reliance in Europe on natural gas, especially in Germany. Europe does have a lot of nuclear reactors, and there are nuclear reactors in Ukraine. In fact, the largest one in Europe is in the Ukraine, and the Russians have, I think they've overtaken that. It's still being run by Ukrainian experts because it takes an expert to work in one of those places, but there's some danger with that. And they can increase the output from the other nuclear reactors that are located throughout Europe, but how much they can do, how quickly, and you can't necessarily substitute electric for gas. So they're in a quandary. Saudi Arabia can actually increase the oil production, but at what price are they going to do that, and for how long? And so there's a lot of consternation about that. A lot of the things I've read say that we here in the US, believe it or not, we in the US have felt the most immediate effect from these things, even though we don't import much of our gas from, or our oil from Russia. So we've seen high gasoline and diesel prices. In Europe, the diesel prices are a lot more, a lot higher percentage, and those prices are through the roof. But we've seen electric bills increasing even here. We've seen volatile natural gas prices because we're not sure what's going on. So we're seeing it. All of Europe is seeing it. It's a real up and down kind of thing. And it's important to note that I learned that there are some northeastern states, in particular Maine, that actually import some natural gas from Russia. Not 100% and not consistently, but over time they have done that to offset some of the needs that they have. Luckily, we're going into March, and so we're getting into the warmer time of year. But if you've been to the north, like in Maine this time of year, it can still be pretty cold. And as we've seen watching the weather, they can get snowstorms into March and April. So it's going into the right time to not need as much heat, but we still need that. So the global food supply is another huge issue. And if I'm come from a farmer's background, my mother's family farmed, and I always say my father married into that, so he became a farmer too. And food supply chains start with growing crops and feed, and that requires fertilizer. Raw material prices for fertilizer are up 30% since the start of 2022. That includes things like ammonia, nitrogen, potash, nitrates. And prices for nitrogen are now 4 times higher than they were 2 years ago. Potash and phosphates are about 3 times higher than they were 2 years ago. So this is an important contribution to all of this. And we know that that hurts farmers and that hurts all of us, but developing countries have been able to offset some of these price increases through higher price on their crops. But now with the inflation on top of this and all of these issues, it's the availability, it's putting these farmers at great risk. So if these prices, which have already tripled and quadrupled, now they're up 30% more since the beginning of the year, this is potentially devastating to some of these countries that really need their local crops to survive. And I always caution people, don't forget that fertilizers are also used in weapons. If you remember the Oklahoma City bombing, that was done with fertilizer. So it has potential to be used not only as a fertilizer, but other applications as well. What we do know is that, and we know that fertilizer increases in prices drive crop prices. And if we have a shortage on top of that, with that third of the global production of wheat not being available at the end of this year into next year, that could be a huge problem. So the Ukraine has been a major supplier of crops like corn and barley, as well as the wheat that we've been talking about. And I said, if you look at corn and where corn goes and corn syrup, it's in many of the things that you had no idea that you were eating. Production from other countries can kind of mitigate the impact, including the US and Canada, because we can increase some of the wheat and the things that we produce. But again, it takes a whole season to produce these crops. And then after the harvest, they have to be processed. So this could be a lasting effect for 2, 3, 5 years. And who knows how long this is actually going to go on in between Ukraine and Russia, and what Russia is going to do after the Ukraine situation is settled, regardless of how it's settled. There are many that are telling us that they don't feel Russia is going to stop at the Ukraine. It could keep going and going. And there are a lot of countries around there that, again, impact us in lots of different ways. So as far as food goes, we've talked about that. Sunflower oil is the other one from Russia as far as food. I've talked about the palladium and the copper in a little bit, but sunflower oil, I don't buy sunflower oil as such, but it's used in things like potato chips. So if you think a lot of those kinds of products that we buy and that we just expect to be on the shelf, there's sunflower oil. Again, read some labels and you'll find out that sunflower oil is in a lot of different products we buy. So the metals are an important area. Nickel is one that comes to mind. I even heard somebody on NPR the other day say we should maybe start hoarding nickels. So I hate to hear things like that because people actually do those things. But nickel prices have surged 66% just on March 7th. So huge amount there in price increases. So this company, Chinese company, owes billions of dollars to large banks that is associated with nickel production. And these trades on the London Metal Exchange by the Chinese have caused a lot of these price increases, but it's also halted trading altogether. With these price increases, people are saying, no, we're not buying. So it's kind of a stalemate kind of thing because they can't not buy forever. So how are we going to get through this? Australian company IGO planned to buy a mining company, Western Areas Limited, for $800 million, but a nickel mine. But now this price increase has caused a delay in that because they're looking at the valuation of Western Areas Limited and what it's going to be worth now with the nickel prices going up 50-60%. The purchase was expected to be completed in April. Now they're pushing that out to May or June, and who knows if they can get that closed at that time. IGO is not willing to increase their offering for that. And so it's kind of anybody's guess as to where we go from here. They already had an agreement and it was very close to being completed. Like I said, it was planned for April. But now with this issue and the need for nickel to go into a lot of these other alloys, specifically steel and stainless steel, then that's a big problem. Other areas, Russia controls a lot of copper mines. They have large copper reserves, and they're a major producer of both nickel and platinum. They produce 40% of the palladium that's used in car electronic production, which again is substantial. So the automobile companies are telling Russia, we're shutting down, we're not selling into you, and Russia's producing 40% of the palladium they need in their car productions. So this, again, we're looking at potential stalemates and issues. Palladium is also available from South Africa, but not immediately to offset that 40% that was typically coming into the global supply chain from Russia. Titanium production is heavy in Russia. If you've worked in the aerospace business, they use a lot of titanium because it's harder than aluminum. And it's very lightweight. So it's much lighter weight than steel, and it's tougher and stronger than aluminum. So they also use it in some automotive applications, and there's some medical applications as well. So there's a lot of issues there, and titanium, a lot of titanium comes from Russia. It is not readily available throughout the world. There are no titanium deposits here in the United States. So if we look at the internet and we look at the IT actions and what's going on, 2017, just 5 years ago, there was a company, NotPetya, had an attack on Ukrainian tax software that brought down Maersk's IT infrastructure, because I told you that the US outsourced some software and IT into the Ukraine. So did Maersk, and Maersk is the largest shipper in the world. At that point, it brought down their IT infrastructure, and it was across multiple companies that cost a total of $7.3 billion. Now we find 3 new variants appearing in about the mid-February timeframe in the Ukraine. One is called the Isaac wiper, the Hermetic wiper, and the Caddy wiper, which is the most recently identified. So they're looking at these, and you can look these up if you want more detail. I didn't want to go into detail of all of these, but Russia has been connected to hacking and ransomware in the past, including that dark side gang. If you remember the Colonial pipeline from 2021, where they had the 4.4 million ransomware paid. And they have been able, the FBI has been able to recover most, if not all, of that money, but they haven't been able to get to the hackers themselves. If you remember, they bought that through cryptocurrency, and that's using the blockchain technology. So they were able to track the dollars, but they couldn't necessarily find the hackers in there. And that dark side gang has done several other hacking jobs in ransomware. So we have these variants that come up, and what Microsoft says is, from what they can tell, there's no profit motive. Microsoft states that the intended objectives of these attacks is just disruption, degradation, and destruction of targeted resources in the Ukraine. So this is just an attempt to further mess everything up that's in the Ukraine. If you know, Fedorov is the IT government agency, and he tweeted a direct plea to Elon Musk, urging him to send help. Musk replied just hours later, and he said, Starlink service is now active in Ukraine. More terminals are en route. So far, they've received thousands of antennas delivered to the Ukraine after that tweet. They are still getting shipments every day, every couple of days. And that's really helped the stable communication across the Ukraine with the outside world. The tweet he sent, I love, and I should have put a picture in here. He says to Elon Musk, while you try to colonize Mars, Russia tries to occupy Ukraine. While your rockets successfully land from space, Russian rockets attack Ukraine's civil people. We ask you to provide Ukraine with Starlink stations and to address sane Russians to stand. So Musk replied back, Starlink services now active. And he started sending the antennas right away. So that has been one of the bright spots in there. But that continues to be a problem. And it continues to be essential that we have really good information about what is happening in Ukraine, since there is so much media hype around this. You have to look at 3-4 sources to kind of figure out the truth. And as I said before, the Russian propaganda around that is staggering. So we've got manufacturers, we've got some service providers, now we've got logistics. What we found, like most companies, logistic providers were aware of things like the pandemic, extreme weather, price instability, but just like most of the other companies in the world in the other industries, they were caught very much by surprise by this Ukrainian invasion of Russia. And as I mentioned before, this $1 trillion project, the rail line, aimed at reshaping global trade and affirming the dominance of the China-centric global supply chain, but that China to Europe rail is just not working. They're canceling things all the time. Companies are afraid to send their goods that way. They don't know what Russia's going to do as the goods progress from China to Europe. And so it's really backed a lot of things up. Dwell times are what we look at a lot. Again, before I started the presentation, one of the people on the line said they had some parts that got stuck in Korea for 40 days. They were coming from China to the US. They went from China to Korea, got stuck for dwell times, 40 days in Korea, and finally made it to the US. But what we're seeing in European ports is the dwell times are increasing 25%. Transshipment dwell times for European ports is up 43%. European consumer packaged goods and food and beverage, those dwell times are up 55%. And ocean freight rates are up as much as 20 to 40 times. There were some examples of a $2,000 freight rate a year ago was like $54,000 now. So the rates are crazy. What we do know is that Maersk has stopped inbound and outbound shipments to Russia. So they've done that on their own initiative. Maersk, again, the largest shipper in the world. Shipments into Russia starting in mid-February, we're down as much as 17% week over week starting back in February. So that's been now about 6 weeks. And that there are hundreds of tankers and bulk carriers stranded at ports. And if you look at the news or anything, you'll see that yachts have been stopped by the oligarchs, and in different countries and different areas, they're trying to find out who exactly owns some of those. And I think there was one in, I think it was Finland, but it might have been Sweden, that the crew abandoned it because, or they were actually just kind of hanging out because the locals refused to give them fuel. So they don't have enough fuel to go and leave, so they're stuck. And in other areas, I've seen a couple of those yachts that were abandoned. Now that's a very small piece, and it's not an important piece of the global dollars and the global GDP, but it's an interesting activity that's going on. So financial implications, actually, I could go on and on in this area. I'm still learning about the SWIFT legislation and what that means, but that's complicating payments. They have suspended some of the SWIFT activities, not all, so that's still on the table for a lot of companies looking at sanctions. There are a lot of sanctions on Russian businesses. Some of those are expected to have long-term effects. Some of them have already started to hit the companies and the people in Russia. And so that's kind of a stay tuned thing. What we're seeing from Russia, again, the threat to nationalize assets of Western companies. So that could prevent and reduce job loss within Russia, but it also could create problems because those assets will no longer be, and those facilities no longer be associated with the companies that actually put them into place. Russia is very much looking at their ability to produce goods domestically, but that has been a challenge in the past. And there are thousands of Russian workers that are in limbo. Some stoppages have been deemed temporary. Some companies are continuing to pay their workers, at least at this point. Other companies have suspended their pay as well as the work that has been going on there. Some of this is related to sanctions. Some of it is related to the boycotts and the companies shutting down. But definitely supply chains have been interrupted. Again, most companies have cut off the shipment both inbound and outbound of goods into Russia, and they're adding Belarus into that portfolio as well. And then some companies say they're leaving for good. If you look at BP, British Petroleum, they say they're leaving Russia. They have a 20% stake in Russian oil producer Rosneft, and they are just leaving. That 20% stake was valued at about $14 billion at the end of 2021, and they expect to recoup none of that. So they have just decided, we're done, we're out of here, we're taking our toys and going home. Mercedes has suspended exports of cars and vans. That's estimated to them up to a $2 billion impact. Fast food restaurants, I told you McDonald's, $50 million a month from 847 stores. Global food production, because that wheat has to be harvested and then it has to be processed so it can be shipped and milled and turned into other products. So that usually is done locally, and then they ship things like the flour into other places. The semiconductor industry, again, the metals is a big deal, the neon, all of those things, the titanium, palladium, and then all of the shipping and logistics in and out of there has been compounded and really just affected by all of this. So usually I say what I know for sure at the end. I don't know anything for sure right now. There are just too many questions because these things are changing daily. We see impacts very quickly in a few weeks that are very far reaching, and many of the things that I read and see indicate that the impacts are going to be increasing over time. They're definitely going to be increasing over time. The sanctions to Russia from the beginning, they've said there will be some immediate pain, but a lot of that will take longer for them to feel that pain. But other parts of the world too, we have that, and how much that increases over time. There's just so many unknowns. As I said before, the logistics company were unprepared. We've all been focused on things like The weather, the climate change, the issues that we had, like from the freeze. I have a client who says they had chemical force majeures last year from the Texas shutdowns, and they're still dealing with some of that. And hurricane season was rough, and we've had some weather issues in different parts of the country, including tornadoes recently. So that we expect. The pandemic we've all been living with now for 2 years. We passed that official kind of milestone this month in March, depending on what day you look at for that announcement that it was a pandemic. And we still are dealing with it. I'm still wearing masks at school every day, and they've told us we will wear masks on campus till the end of the semester, at least. I'm reading that there are other variants being identified, and who knows what those are going to look like. And I think I am, like many people and companies, in a wait and see mode. I'm looking at this, I'm trying to evaluate it, understand it, analyze it. There is so much to take in. And many of us are just in a wait and see mode. And I'm not sure that it pays to be very proactive at this point on very many things, except maybe to evaluate options, because we just don't know what's going to happen from here. So that's dynamic dialogue today. What I have planned is for April would be dealing with shortages. May would talk about risk-based decision-making. June, talk about skills, and maybe July, what's the second half of 22. But for the first time, I put an asterisk that said, all these are subject to change due to this Ukrainian situation. At the beginning of this year, I chose to change this format from twice a month to once a month. If we get a lot more changes from Ukraine, I may go back to twice a month, depending on what my audience likes and what is going on with the world that I think needs to be shared. So you can check out our website, contact me directly there. And if you want to talk about these subjects more in depth, if there's things that you have questions on, issues, if you'd like to work with Purple Ink on helping your company through some of these challenges, you can do this call with Jane. It's a free call. It's 30 minutes to talk about how Purple Ink can help your business. I've had some changes to this last part too, but CPSM class is finishing up this month, but we're going to start CPSM 2 in May right now. So if you're interested in getting your CPSM, May is a good time to start. Risk-based thinking and decision-making, that's looking like Q2, but maybe the June timeframe. And then a Lean and Six Sigma is going to be in the fall. So there'll be online workshops for that. So I always say I leave you with strive to thrive, because I think that's my kind of credo and my battle cry. So I've become a big fan of Zelensky, President Zelensky of the Ukraine. And I thought I'm just going to put one of these on. And I looked at all of there's several on that I can find. And there were a couple of these that I thought were just very powerful and that were worth sharing. The one he said to Russia, kind of said, bring it. He said, it will be our faces you see, not our backs. So they are standing, they are defending their country, I think, which is a real surprise to Russia. By all accounts that I've read, Russia was surprised at their reaction and their determination, their tenacity, their involvement in all of this. At one point, he was called iconic, and his response was, I'm not iconic. Ukraine is iconic. And the leadership that we've seen from this gentleman, I think, has been almost unequivocal anywhere in time. My favorite one, though, is President Biden offered to send in transportation to get him to a safe location. And he said, the fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride. And to me, that is just such a powerful message that he's sending to his people, to the country of Ukraine. And myself personally, I'm horrified that the Russians have attacked and invaded an independent country such as Ukraine. The Crimea was horrible, and this is that on steroids. So I'm personally very hurt by this, offended, and have sending all my positive energy to Ukraine to be able to withstand this. So that's what I have today, and I'm happy to take questions or comments from anybody. I'll stop sharing and turn the recording off and open up the lines.